Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending. My name is Stephen Dumesnil, and I lead the network governance team at IBM Cloud. And today's discussion is going to be around how we automate security and compliance using SaltStack and SecOps. Now, I want to provide a little bit of context around what I mean when I say SecOps. So SecOps is an actual module that SaltStack designed to go on top of SaltStack Enterprise. And I'll be going into that a little bit later in the presentation here. But I just wanted to clarify that because you can have security operations natively with SaltStack, and we'll provide some examples of that as well. And I know when people use different terminologies, we just kind of want to quantify what exactly we're talking about. So during this presentation, I'll be providing some examples of how you can use native SaltStack and SecOps to create end-to-end security and compliance. Some of our topics of discussion will be the challenges of managing security and compliance at enterprise cloud scale, how you can leverage SaltStack's API-driven interface and modular design to deliver targeted results. We'll talk about creating a single-pane security and compliance view with SaltStack SecOps. We'll discuss some advanced audit and reporting capabilities. And we'll also talk about using SaltStack's extensibility to customize your SecOps environment. So we operate a network of 80,000 plus network devices worldwide. And my team is responsible for ensuring the security and compliance of all this network infrastructure. And this goes beyond just simple vulnerability management. We have lots of customers that operate in highly regulated environments, and they come to us with those requirements and expectations and expect us to be able to meet those standards. That's why it's so critical to have an automated system such as SaltStack and SecOps to help you manage these requirements at scale. So this is the as-a-service landscape. So if you've ever heard of IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, this kind of describes what does that really mean. So here in the first column, this is traditional IT infrastructure. These are companies that own and operate their own data centers, their own infrastructure itself. Then as you move into the as-a-service column, you start with infrastructure as a service. So these are things like networking, storage, servers, virtualization. IBM Cloud is really big on bare metal servers, for example, and things like that. Then as you move up into PaaS and SaaS, these are just higher levels of abstraction. So they're taking things from you and saying, we'll handle this for you. You don't have to worry about it. Just develop your applications, and we're going to run it for you. Now, the implications of this is that while we're doing that, we're providing you a secure and compliant environment. We're not just letting it run and hoping everything works out. So that brings us into some of the compliance programs that we participate in. So there's a lot of compliance programs out there that help in certifying businesses to host these regulated workloads. They outline various process and controls that ensure we align with those security standards. So if any of you have ever had to operate in a highly compliant environment, you know the toll it can take on your operations team. So we have a compliance team, and they are kind of our proxy between us and the auditors. So they'll gather those evidence requests, data requests, they'll set up on-site audits, they'll process the follow-up requests and all those things. And with all of this going on, it becomes really hard to manage at scale. And as you notice here, we have regional requirements as well. So we have this worldwide network that we have to manage. We have different regions with different requirements, and we have to constantly, throughout the year, be interfacing with these auditors and giving them confidence that we're living up to these standards. And so having something like SaltStack and SecOps is really powerful in that context, and I'll describe a little bit more on that later. So this is a classic workflow you might see in most teams when they deal with security and compliance. So you typically start with some black box security tool that performs a scan. It probably isn't managed by the operations team. It's probably managed by a third, by an internal to the company, but external to your organization. And they'll return those results to you. And then you have to take those results and try to understand them. So they've kind of pointed at the problem, and now you have to identify the solutions to solve them. And a lot of times they'll drop that report into another tool, and that way they can assign and manage those reports. And then what you do is you have to kind of triage the results and say, what am I going to fix first, and how am I going to fix it? And when you're a cloud provider, you have customers that you need to coordinate with. You know, especially in the network infrastructure, we haven't gotten to the point where the entire environment can just be upgraded without no disruption, or at least risk of disruption that you need to notify your customers that may occur. So that in and itself, with customer SLAs and things like that, is challenging. Then once you go and you remediate, you either apply the vendor patch, you apply mitigating control, whatever it may be. They come in, they rescan, and they resolve the ticket, and then you move on to the next day. This doesn't account for some maybe intermediate controls that you may put in place. So for example, Cisco may release an advisory that says some feature is vulnerable, it's critical, and we've released a security patch to remediate it and apply it now. However, if you disable it, you can have an intermediate mitigation to kind of reduce the risk of that attack vector while you're going through those maintenance activities, and you may want to implement that. So how do you communicate that to security and the compliance auditors that are coming in looking at your security posture, right? So that's a lot of manual effort, a lot of screenshots, a lot of evidence showing, and a lot of manual processes involved with that. So what are some of the advantages of bringing in a tool like SaltStack into this highly secure and compliant environment? Well, it allows you to centralize the management of configurations, which can be declared across multiple devices and device types. And that's really important, as we're going to show here in the next slide. Allows a modular approach to configuration management. Has things like beacons and reactors that you can set to monitor for unauthorized changes or config drift, and you can revert those changes back with a declared state. You can log events to remote locations for audit and reporting requirements. They have things like proxy minions, which allow communications with devices that don't support the installation of a native agent on the device itself. And the Salt API and the Enterprise GUI provide an easy-to-use interface for managing large environments at scale. So I made this visual just to provide a high-level view of the core Salt files and how they kind of have a relationship with each other and how that can be applied out to the environment. So whenever I got into the governance team and started interacting with a lot of auditors and things like that, I noticed that they kept referring to certain configurations as security configurations. And that was kind of new to me. I always considered network device configurations as single flat files, and each one, you have templates maybe for certain device types, but at the end of the day, they were flat files that you loaded onto a device. And so when I started learning about SaltStack, I started to think about configurations in a little bit different way, because we have all these vendors out there. I have Cisco, Arista, and Juniper, but this list isn't comprehensive. There's more than that. And we know we have some configurations that are constant throughout the environment regardless of vendor. So using SaltStack, I can take things like our AAA, our user access management, S&MP communities, radius, logging, access control list, things of that nature, and say, these are going to be the same, at least maybe per zone, per region, whatever it may be, at least to a contained area. I know it's going to be the same. Why do I need to configure it 7 different times? More importantly, when I want to rotate it, how do I know that it's remained constant and hasn't drifted across my device types? So there's multiple ways that you can manage configurations with Salt. This is just one of them. And there are caveats to this, I'll admit. So if you are really familiar with Salt and you're thinking, well, I have situations where that's not applicable, I completely agree. But just for a high level conceptual view, this just showed you kind of the modular design of being able to manage security configurations consistently across your environment. You'll see here we have Salt pillars and grains, and those are really powerful because Salt allows you to target devices based on this variable data. So, you know, if you want to target a certain role, let's say you want to target all your internal routers, or you want to target a certain operating system version for whatever reason, Salt gives you the ability to do that, and that's really one of the powerful aspects of that. Also storing things like keys, tokens, passwords, and pillar data is really powerful as well. And I'll give an example here where we can extend Salt using Vault module to manage those as well. So I made a little use case, and this may be obvious and it may be not. In my experience working in different networks, if you're not familiar with it, network devices have different ways of accessing them. So you can access it through inline connection, through like SSH, and you can reference something like a radius and Active Directory server with security groups and things like that. And inside those systems are typically password policies, and when someone says, well, how do you manage your password policies, we typically point to that and say, we enforce 60-day password rotations or whatever it may be, and that's kind of how it's done. But some people forget about the other types of access, the out-of-band console access, the VTY admin access, and these systems are used whenever the other systems fail. So when your standard user access controls fail, these are the break glass accounts that are there so that you can access the device. And they enforce that through the configuration to show that you must access the device through these ways, and if as they fail, it allows you to use the other one. So the main problem with this is like with Active Directory, you change it once and it replicates out and you're fine. But when you have 80,000 devices and the local password has to be set locally on the device, that presents a challenge. And you can do some scripting and things like that, but it requires you to account for all your vendor types, all your operating system types, all different kind of command sets required to change that. And so one of the things we're working on is changing something like that with Salt, and leveraging Vault as well to store those passwords to easily rotate them. So now in one place you can rotate the password and it will get replicated out to your entire environment. One of the things I noticed whenever I took over governance was the heavy importance and the conversation around change control. And in most environments, we say, well, we have security groups, we have access controls, and we trust our engineers to not do anything wrong. And that's kind of where it stops. You know, if someone breaks something or does something, you know, we'll find it and we'll investigate it. But we know Salt has a lot of functionality built in. And I provided an example of a situation where you've implemented change control and you have your process and procedures in place. They're clearly outlined, everyone knows to follow them. And ideally, if someone's gonna make a change, they would do it through Salt so that it could plug into your other workflows and keep that for audit and reporting. But let's say someone goes and they make a change through the command line. They have the permissions to, and maybe they're doing something innocent. It's not even malicious. In this case, they went and said, I want to create a new SNMP community string because I want to monitor this device with some tool I'm doing a proof of concept on, and I need to do that. So lots of use cases, innocent use cases where configuration change could happen. But keep in mind, on that screen where we had all those compliance programs, they require you to monitor all change in the environment. So what we can do is we can leverage Salt to watch your configurations for change. And you see here we have an example of someone made the change out of our change control system. They added a SNMP community string. They didn't delete the old one. The old one's still there. All the monitoring's still working. There was no disruption detected in the environment. But they made a change out of band that we need to track and investigate why that change was made. So Salt has a concept of reactors. So you can take events, and you can kind of create like an event-driven architecture where you can react to certain things. And you can set a reactor that says, go back and set my high state for this device. Your high state is basically, what's my baseline state that I want this device to be in. And you can see here, it detected the addition of the additional community. It removed it, and it ensured the original community was back and intact. Now, when you stop there, that sounds pretty good. If you have a tool, it's centrally managed, you're end-to-end automation, you have change control, but you're still lacking one piece that I learned that comes up a lot when these auditors come and visit you, is you can show them all this and say, look what I've done, I've done all this, and then they're gonna say, great, show me a record of the last 6 months of every unauthorized change that was made, the investigation that was done, and the results of it. And you go, oh, well, I talked to Jimmy, and he said he was just adding it for this, and I didn't write it down, but it was okay, it was a legit change, and they just kind of nod their head, and they want you to mature that environment, and they give you some feedback, and then you kind of iterate on that, and kind of what we did is said, we use multiple tools in our environment. One of them, Jira, ServiceNow. So I just picked Jira. You can really change this out with any major ticketing system, and it'll still be applicable. So once you've made that change inside that reactor pipeline that you built, you can say, now take that and report it to Jira. And what we do, the good thing about Jira is you can create visual dashboards and things like that, and you can kind of watch for when these tickets get created, and you can monitor that and say, oh, a new unauth change ticket was created, let me go investigate, and it's gonna drop in the output of the diff. You can collect other things like, we can loop other things such as Splunk and pull off the actual CLI commands that were ran to make that change. So a lot of extensibility here with what you can do. And then when you perform that investigation, you talk to Jimmy and you say, oh, I was just trying to set up something simple. I'm sorry, I won't do it again. And we retrain him on change control. And then we log that and we close it out, and it's there for future reference. So that's just one example of using native Salt for security and compliance. So Salt is powerful, and it has all this capability, but it's really API driven. We use it at the command line a lot. We're dealing with a lot of directory structures and files, and that sometimes is hard to get auditors to wrap their head around when it's that complex and you have a lot going on, and you're trying to give them confidence that, hey, we have it under control. This system is monitoring everything, and we have all these controls in place and process and procedures tied into Salt, and it's really great. And that's okay, but then you have to walk them through it. And I've literally spent weeks of going back and forth of explaining our internal tools, drawing diagrams, and it's really cumbersome. It takes up a lot of time. especially when you have not only one auditor, but 10, 12, 20, all asking, how does this work? Show me the metrics. How, I need to visualize this in some way. So when you bring in SecOps to your enterprise environment, it gives you not only that visual representation, but also some new functionality. So with SecOps, they're bringing in vulnerability identification and mitigation, as well as reporting. And as I'll talk here in a second, the problem isn't completely solved, and we're working with a lot of the other contributors and SaltStack themselves to fill in those gaps that we've identified. But the foundation is there, and it's a really good platform to stand on and get started. And they have a lot of support already baked in for Linux-based systems, I believe Docker and things like that as well. So they really hit the ground running with that, and now we're really maturing the network infrastructure piece of that. So what's the value of having a web interface? Anyone that works in a large environment knows that a lot of times you're not really going to be able to manage it effectively through a GUI. But it does offer a lot of high-level executive reporting type things. So the other good thing about this, especially when you get into talking about vulnerabilities, is once it identifies these vulnerabilities, that's great, but now I have to understand what they are. How critical is it? What's the CVSS score? What's the CVE that it came from? And so I didn't grab a screenshot of this. These are just sample screenshots. These aren't our actual environment. But as you can see over here, it has the top advisories out there, how many instances of those you have in your environment, and you can click on those. You could read about them. You can link to the vendor documentation, which is really useful because that's when you're going to get into, hey, what are my mitigating controls? I can't upgrade 20,000 switches tomorrow, but I can use Salt to disable a feature today. So I want to be able to do that, and I want to know what my options are, what the best way to do that is. The other thing it does, which is really valuable, is benchmarking. So some of the big ones are CIS, Center for Internet Security, I believe it is. But these are basically best practice security baselines you should have in your environment. And they have them for all the top vendors. And even the ones that don't, you could typically find one that pretty closely aligns. Like if Arista doesn't have one, but Cisco does, you can kind of figure it out and kind of align those. And what it does is you can go out there and say, give me my benchmarking status. And what the SALT team has done is they've gone in and individually built states to represent each one of these benchmarks. And that's another benefit that it brings in, because you could make the argument, you know, this is a state-driven system. You could go in there and manually build each one of these checks to go. You can go in and manually build a state to go apply that configuration. But the amount of engineering manpower that would take to do that would just be really hard. So to have a dedicated team focused on doing that was really valuable to us. We had a benchmarking system that was tied into our vulnerability scanner, which we actually still run in parallel while we're maturing this process. And the challenges there are not every benchmark is applicable for every device in every environment. So what we found ourselves doing is having to create exceptions. So now we're back in this legacy workflow of I'm inside Jira, I have all these benchmarks that have been reported on all these devices, and I'm trying to organize them and create exceptions and then get approvals for those exceptions and then justify it. And by the time I end up doing that, it's months and months later, and then now I have to keep track of that whenever auditors come and go, well, why are you not benchmarking off this? And then the conversation continues and you're justifying and diagrams and so on and so forth. So having a single pane view and being able to walk auditors through and say, this is the current security posture of my environment. You can visualize it. It's not just a number. They can dive in if they want to take sample sets and say, let's go look at this CVE and see how many you have, what's your remediation plan, all that kind of stuff. So a lot of things you could do there. So here's an example of a report. And let's say you run a report on your benchmarking, and it comes back and it says, hey, all of these are out of compliance. And it looks red and there's criticals, and you're like, oh, this isn't gonna look good. I can't show this to anybody until I get this under control. Then you start to look through it and you go, oh, wait, these are some that are not really applicable for our environment. So you go in and you start to add in those justifications there for reference, and then apply those. It's really make it once, and then once you know what it applies to, you're done. You don't have to do it 20,000 times and copy and paste into a bunch of tickets and make bulk updates. Just do it once and say, for this target of devices, this is an exception that we've accepted. And you can implement other approvals as much as you want. So I think that we're working in, someone can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if there's an actual approval section in there or if you can just annotate it, but I think that's one of the things that we wanted to do, is actually be able to have a name in there that says the CISO or whoever approved this. One of the things that I thought immediately whenever they started having conversations with us about this SecOps module was, you're not going to automate network patching. It's, anyone that's ever dealt with network patching knows that requires intimate knowledge of the patch itself, any changes that it brings into the environment, testing's required. And a lot of times with network devices, it requires a reboot. And so even if you're on an HA system and you don't expect to be downtime, you still need to orchestrate it. You still need to communicate with your customers that you're going to be performing maintenance. So you can't just let this thing go out and say remediate and run with it. And so one of those challenges, I brought that up in a lot of our initial talks, and we've started to come out with a lot of good ideas about how to handle that. So we're kind of on a journey, and as we continue on that journey, we're going to continue to iterate on these problems, and we hope to be one of the leaders in driving some of those solutions. But we have some really good ideas of how to leverage native Salt functionality with SecOps to tie in a mapping of dependencies. Let's say you have a vulnerability that's affecting thousands of devices, all running different operating systems that all need to go up to different build paths. You want to all bring them up to a new gold standard, but depending on where the device is at, you may need to go on a different build path. So we have some ideas of how to map with pillar data and grain data and things like that, and also plugging into some of our other systems like ServiceNow for customer notifications and things like that, as well as what do you do when hardware fails, you have to replace a device. So all those challenges are something that we're continuing to work on, and we're excited to be able to be solving them with the SALT team. Here's another great thing that I really liked about SecOps, is that it's not black box. Whenever you have other scanners out there, you just trust that they're doing what they want to do. Maybe if you have contact with the vendor itself, they may give you insight into what's going on if you make a targeted request of, hey, what's this scan doing? But a lot of times that's not readily available. And if you want to change it, you can't. You pretty much have to put in a feature request and hope that they would work with you. But because SecOps is state-driven, you can go and gather insights into what these states are doing. How is it gathering the information? And that's one question I would always have, especially when we would get some false positives from our other scanning tool, was how did it determine that the device was in this state? And the answer a lot of times is, well, it looks at the version it was running. And I was like, well, if it's running a certain version, but the feature that's vulnerable is disabled, shouldn't that at least lower my lower my risk level? Shouldn't I be able to communicate that and not have to manually go in and take screenshots proving that it's disabled and so on and so forth? So that's another thing I really liked about SecOps is I can actually go in there and customize it and say, hey, this check is looking for this vulnerability. Let me extend that a little bit and look a little bit deeper and assign my own risk score. Not that I don't want to identify it and remediate it, but just give a more accurate risk profile of that vulnerability given its context in the environment. On the benchmarking side, we noticed that they support CIS, DISA-STIGs, but we deal with a lot of different compliance programs that have different controls for different regions, and being able to provide confidence to those auditors that you are aligning to those standards is really manual and sample set driven and doesn't really show completeness. But through the targeting system and through the SecOps, being able to customize the SecOps environment, I can show completeness because I can run a targeted security benchmarking scan against a set of devices in a region and show that, hey, these devices are configured properly to meet these controls. So that's a really powerful thing. So I want to talk a little bit more about the extensibility of SaltStack. And in large environments, no one's going to centralize on a single tool. I'm not going to be able to go out there and lobby for compute and fabric and storage to all use SaltStack and all use SaltStack reporting so that we can all be doing the same happy reports. It's just not going to happen. Everyone has different requirements. And compliance, like I said, is overseeing all of these teams and being our proxy to the auditors and generating reports, providing evidence to them. So they need a centralized place to collect that. And with our goal of creating end-to-end security and compliance, we knew we needed a way to plug into those tools and leverage them so that way we could step to the side and let the automation continue all the way through. And so what we did is we developed a custom Jira module. There is a Jira module that's available through open source, but due to the workflows, the custom workflows, the unique IDs, there's just really no way to kind of really open source that. Once you get to a certain point in open source, it becomes custom to your environment, and that's kind of where we landed. And so now with SecOps and SaltStack, we can extend that into Jira. I pause there because I was remembering I have another slide next. So I'm going to show exactly really how we do that. So if you're familiar with the concept of things like pillars, this is an example. I think that you could probably do this a few ways. A lot of times we find a solution, we'll take a step back and say, is this really the best way to do it? Does this fit in with our other design standards that we're using within SALT? But I wanted to provide this just as an anecdotal example at the very least to say, we have Jira and we know that we have some unique fields. So we're going through a SOC audit. Compliance is going to begin opening up evidence requests targeted at the networking group and saying, for each of these controls, they have a unique value. So IDR 060, for example, I know may tie to operating system version or whatever it may be. And they'll typically select a sample set of devices out of our inventory and say, provide me evidence of IDR 0660 on these sample set of devices. And before, we would have to go out, take screenshots, copy them all back into Jira, into zip file, or whatever it may be, and the process continues and continues with all the other audits, and it's never ending. So with our known knowns, if I know what they want for a data request, and I know I have a Jira ticket that will eventually exist with these values, why can't I tell SaltStack to basically query Jira and look for these values, and then create a mapping in a pillar file, for example, that says, hey, if you find a JIRA with this IDR request, execute the IDR request state that I've built, which it goes out and gathers the grain data about that device, such as operating system, whether it may be, return that, and return it to the ticket. There's one piece here that I missed out. I should have added is we have fields for host names and IPs, so you can also reference that value. That's your target. So you have your target, and then what am I going to execute against those targets? And I'm going to return those results to the ticket. And because of the custom JIRA module, I'm detecting what type of request that is and know what workflow it needs to go to. So the next workflow might be compliance review. So now compliance is going to review that, determine that, yes, this is the information that they wanted, and then compile that into their report. So that's all my known knowns. I go through and I build in all these data requests. I tie them to a salt state that can typically go out and gather grain data for the most part for a lot of these. And I just step back and let it do it. I can watch the JIRA project. I can create a dashboard and make sure that nothing's failing, build in some checks, maybe something failed. I want to alert that, things like that. But for the most part, you can really create an end-to-end system there. Okay, well, I wanted to open it up for Q&A. I know I kind of kept it high level, but that was just to really give you guys a little bit of an insight into what SecOps is, some of the native functionality you can leverage within SALT for security and compliance. And I'd be happy to take any questions. And if I don't know the answer, then I'll politely ask you to leave and we'll move to the next person. I'm just kidding. Are there any questions? Yes, sir. Oh, hold on. They asked me to bring back the mic here so that we can get it on the recording.
With Enterprise Manager, have you found that there's a max number of users who can access it at one time to pull those reports? If not, what is your normal user load on it?
Okay, security. Get this guy. No, so he asked. He brought up a good point, and I forgot to mention this. He said, you know, if you have a bunch of users trying to access this and generate the reports, is there kind of a limit and do you reach a point where you have too many people trying to do the same things? And that's definitely a concern, and why you want to use user access controls within SALT to control, number one, who can execute what, and really define those areas. So, you know, if you only want the governance team generating these reports, you don't want people in there just clicking stuff and making SALT work really hard and reach out to thousands of minions and things like that. There are ways to control that. I haven't experienced any issues as far as user scalability. We've had some problems with scalability as far as the amount of minions that are talking to each master. And one thing I forgot to mention is kind of the relationship between my team and the larger network engineering organization. We have a network tools team that is responsible for the deployment of SaltStack, and they're a group of really smart engineers, and they've been working with the SALT engineers to solve a lot of our scalability problems. And so they provide us the platform to stand on, and we kind of are the security and compliance focused part of that equation. So no user scalability problems at this point, and the minion scalability problem, I believe, was solved by multiple masters talking to a set of minions. And then someone asked me yesterday, well, what's the advantage of enterprise? And that use case is exactly where it comes in. When you have multiple masters, but you want a single pane view of all your masters and minions, that's where enterprise comes in is really valuable, along with that user access control. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I appreciate you guys coming to the session, and I'd be happy to answer any questions one-on-one if you think of them later, and find me out in the expo hall, and that'll be it. Have a good day.